Court records from Wilkerson County, Georgia describe an incident involving 5 plantation overseers who entered the Ohiapo River bottomlands on October 14, 1839. Only one returned, staggering out of the swamp 36 hours later, unable to form a coherent sentence for nearly 3 weeks. The coroner's inquest officially listed the remaining 4 as victims of swamp conditions, yet witnesses noticed the survivor's hands were slashed with strange, deliberate-looking scratches. He spent days outside the county jail, obsessively tracing the same symbol into the dirt, a shape local native elders claimed signified the hunted becoming the hunter. For over a century, the descendants of those overseers have refused to discuss the event, and the original incident report mysteriously vanished from county archives in 1847. The truth of what happened when 5 armed men chased a 15-year-old girl into wilderness she understood more intimately than her own name has been intentionally concealed. But fragments of forgotten testimony reveal a story unsettling enough to challenge anyone who believes numbers guarantee safety. Before we continue with what happened in those Georgia bottomlands, if dark historical mysteries fascinate you, go ahead and subscribe and hit the notification bell. And tell me in the comments, what state or city are you watching from? Now, let's uncover what truly unfolded when 5 men made the fatal mistake of underestimating their target. The events that followed exposed something more disturbing than a simple tragedy in the wilderness. They revealed how mastery of the land could turn a supposed victim into survivor and turn pursuers into prey. Wilkerson County, Georgia, in 1839 occupied a strange corner of the state's geography, too distant from Savannah's refined coastal elites to attract wealthy planters, yet uncomfortably close to creek territories that had only recently been emptied by forced removal. The plantations, there were smaller operations run by men who'd arrived from the Carolinas after their fortunes collapsed, desperate to extract profit from land that resisted cultivation. The Ohiapo River bottomlands, marking the county's eastern edge, held a notorious reputation. Even before the Creek people were driven out in 1836, they treated this swamp with caution. Seasonal flooding shifted the waterways constantly, carving new channels that disoriented even skilled hunters. The cypress stands grew so tightly packed that daylight barely touched the ground, and the perpetual damp encouraged thick vegetation capable of hiding a person standing just 3 feet away. Curtains of Spanish moss concealed entire footpaths, and the earth itself was treacherous. Solid ground had turned to sucking mud in a matter of paces. The Gresham plantation lay on the western rim of these bottomlands, 400 acres of struggling cotton worked by 37 enslaved people. Thomas Gresham had purchased the property in 1834 after consecutive crop failures in South Carolina drove him into bankruptcy. He mortgaged everything to start anew in Georgia, yet 5 years later he remained perched at the edge of financial collapse. His cotton yields lagged far behind neighboring farms. His soil wore out faster than he could clear new land, and his enslaved labor force was, in his own words, unmanageable. Gresham employed 5 overseers, far more than a plantation of his size required, insisting the arrangement was necessary. In truth, whispered by neighboring planters' wives, these overseers were men no reputable estate would touch. They'd been fired from operations in Alabama and Mississippi for extreme brutality, in regions where cruelty was already standard. Gresham hired them because they were cheap and unquestioning. Jacob Yarwick, the head overseer, was a 42-year-old man who'd been working plantations since boyhood. He was precise in his cruelty, keeping meticulous ledgers of punishments administered and calculating exactly how much torment a person could withstand before their productivity dropped. His younger brother, Samuel Yarwick, acted as his assistant, equally systematic but without Jacob's restraint. The remaining overseers, Nathaniel Cruz, William Tyson, and Henry Burke, were younger men drawn to Gresham's property precisely because it allowed them to indulge their worst impulses without consequence. Among the enslaved on the Gresham plantation was a girl named Celia, 15 years old in October 1839. Her mother had been of Creek descent, taken during the skirmishes leading up to removal and illegally sold into slavery. Her father had been African, smuggled into Georgia through the outlawed slave trade that persisted despite federal bans. Celia inherited her mother's intimate knowledge of the Bottomlands and her father's mechanical skill. She could navigate terrain that baffled others and fashion practical tools from materials most people ignored. Celia attended the plantation's vegetable gardens, a task that theoretically kept her closer to the main house and away from the field overseer's constant supervision. But Thomas Gresham's wife had died 2 years earlier, leaving household duties unmanaged, and the overseer's attention had begun to shift towards Celia as she matured. She learned to move silently, to sense when danger approached, to shrink herself into the background. The creek removal had hit the Gresham plantation harder than most. Several enslaved people had maintained quiet ties with nearby creek communities, exchanging knowledge and occasionally food. When the tribes were forced west, those connections vanished instantly. But before dying of fever in 1838, Celia's mother had taught her daughter everything she could: how to read the forest, identify edible plants, locate clean water, interpret animal signs, navigate by stars, moss, and tree growth patterns. This knowledge was about to become the line between life and death. October 14th, 1839 opened under a choking blanket of fog that obscured even the closest plantation buildings. Cotton still needed picking regardless of visibility, and the enslaved workers moved into the fields at dawn as usual. Celia carried water between the rows, a task that kept her within sight of multiple workers, a survival tactic she'd long relied on. Around mid-morning, Samuel Yarwick approached her, ordering her to report to the overseer's cabin. Celia recognized his tone instantly, understood the specific look in his eyes. She had been avoiding this moment for months, but the command was explicit, and refusing it meant immediate retaliation. She walked toward the cabin, but instead of entering, she kept going. She slipped past the building and headed straight for the eastern boundary, toward the Bottomlands. Behind her, she heard Samuel's startled shout, then his rising anger. She didn't run at first. Running would have signaled guilt, would have given them the excuse they wanted. Instead, she walked with steady purpose, as if simply obeying orders. But when Samuel's shouts drew the other overseers, when she heard multiple voices gathering, and sensed that particular excitement men showed when they scented a chase, then she ran. The Bottomland began abruptly there, solid ground dissolving into swamp without warning. Celia hit the tree-line at full speed, her bare feet gripping terrain that would have tripped any booted man. Behind her, the voices multiplied. Not just Samuel now, but Jacob's commanding bark and the eager, reckless replies of the younger overseers. Even Thomas Gresham appears the 5 overseers snatched up rifles and coils of rope. Later, a field worker testified to hearing Gresham say they would bring the girl back unspoiled, because damaged property can be sold, and he needed every asset he could liquidate. Jacob Yarwick's answer, overheard by the same witness, suggested he was far less concerned about property value. The 5 men entered the forest 15 minutes after Celia vanished into the trees. They carried rifles, knives, rope, and the absolute confidence of men who had never once faced consequences for anything they'd done. They'd tracked escapees before, always successfully. A 15-year-old girl alone in the wilderness? They expected to catch her within hours, exhausted, frightened, compliant. The Ohiapo Bottomlands were dangerous, true, but not to armed men accustomed to forest pursuit. What they didn't know was that Celia had been preparing for this moment since the night her mother died. During her water run duties, she had been quietly moving supplies into the forest. A kitchen knife hidden in a rotted stump. A tinderbox wrapped in oilcloth tucked inside a hollow trunk. Strips of dried meat from the smokehouse stored in waterproof pouches her mother had taught her to make out of animal bladders. She'd memorized every footpath her mother ever walked with her, every seasonal route through the swamps, every barely visible island of high ground. They expected to find a panicked child. They were about to meet something else entirely. At first, the chase seemed to confirm the overseer's assumptions. They easily located Celia's trail, snapped branches, disturbed brush, the occasional footprint pressed into mud. Jacob Yarwick, an experienced tracker, pointed out each sign with smug satisfaction. The trail led deeper and deeper into the bottomlands, away from neighboring plantations where she might seek help, into wilderness that should have drained her strength and direction. The overseers moved with practiced confidence, pacing themselves. They expected to find her collapse before nightfall. The younger men joked about what they'd do when they caught her, each remark more vicious than the last. Jacob let them talk. Anticipation made fools of men, but he assumed the chase would end like all the others, with capture, punishment, and a restoration of order. But as afternoon bled into evening, the trail began to twist unnaturally. It doubled back on itself. It crossed older paths as if someone were deliberately looping. They'd find clear signs of her passing, then nothing, then prints again in an unexpected place. Samuel suggested the girl was lost, wandering aimlessly, but Jacob stared at the patterns with growing unease. The chaos looked intentional, crafted to force them into circles. When darkness fell, they camped on a relatively dry rise. They lit a fire whose glow turned the hanging moss into ghostly curtains swaying overhead. They took shift of night, 3 awake, 2 asleep. The forest roared with its ordinary nighttime chorus. Frogs, insects, the occasional large animal. No sign of the girl. But dawn brought something that rattled even Jacob. Their packs had been opened, not ripped apart or rummaged through wildly, but neatly, deliberately inspected. Specific items were missing: dried beef, hardtack, 1 canteen. William Tyson swore he'd been awake, watching, and had seen nothing. The moss hadn't stirred. The fire hadn't dimmed. Yet someone had moved through their supplies in total silence. The 5 men exchanged uneasy glances. A terrified runaway does not steal food with surgical precision from 5 armed men. This level of theft suggested planning, confidence, and worst of all, complete comfort in the dark terrain that confused even them with firelight. Jacob made the decision to continue pursuit, but everything had shifted. They were no longer hunting a frightened child. They were following someone who understood this forest far better than they did. Someone who had lured them deep into unfamiliar ground and had crept into their camp unnoticed. The trail resumed that morning, clearer now, as if she wanted to be followed. Samuel murmured that they should turn back, but Jacob pointed out the obvious. They had come too far. To return empty-handed meant admitting failure at aggression. It meant announcing to the county that 5 grown overseers had been outwitted by a teenage girl. Their reputations depended on dominance, on never showing weakness. They had no choice but to keep going. By midday of the second day, Nathaniel Cruz noticed something that halted him mid-step. The trees bore markings, not natural scars, but deliberate symbols carved into the bark. Creek symbols, he thought, though he couldn't read them. They appeared on trees at regular intervals, running parallel to their direction of travel. Jacob studied the carvings and felt a cold heaviness settle in his stomach. These weren't old tribal markings. The sap was still wet, fresh. She was marking their path, leaving a visible record of everywhere they'd been, as though documenting their movements for later use. The pursuit had inverted. They weren't hunting her. She was tracking them, observing their patterns, watching from concealment while they crashed blindly through the undergrowth. She moved silently, efficiently, as though the forest itself lifted her along its paths. That afternoon, they discovered the first cache. Hidden inside a hollow cypress trunk was a collection of items that made no sense. Their rope cut into measured segments. Spent rifle casings, though no one recalled firing. A strip of cloth torn from Henry Burke's shirt, though he insisted his clothes were untouched. The objects had been arranged intentionally, almost, richly arranged, and above them, carved into the hollow tree's inner wall, was another symbol. William Tyson wanted to leave immediately. Something about the display felt wrong. Not the work of someone panicked, but of someone acted with deliberate purpose. They weren't dealing with a frightened fugitive. They were dealing with someone who was collecting from them, observing them, documenting them, and the implications were deeply unsettling. But Jacob's pride wouldn't allow retreat. 5 armed overseers couldn't return to the plantation, defeated by a girl they had been sent to subdue. Such humiliation would destroy their authority, turn them into walking jokes among the enslaved workers. No, they would find her, Jacob insisted, and the punishment for her defiance would be severe enough to destroy any thought of future resistance. They pressed forward, but their earlier cohesion was disintegrating. The younger overseers jumped at every sound, whispered arguments breaking out over which direction to take. The bottomlands seemed to twist beneath their feet. Paths that looked solid dissolved into sucking mire. Dry ground they'd crossed a day before lay submerged under inches of dark water, and the thick curtains of hanging moss reduced visibility to mere feet. They could barely see each other, let alone their surroundings. That evening, they made camp again, but this time no one slept. They posted all 5 men on watch, circling the fire with rifles loaded, forcing back the dark with flames too large for safety. The night sounded different now, louder, more intentional. Something was moving through the forest around them, circling their position, staying just out of sight. Samuel Yarwick snapped first. Near midnight, he suddenly stood and fired his rifle toward a flicker of motion. The shot exploded across the swamp, and the forest fell instantly silent. It was as if the entire bottomland held its breath. Then, slowly, the usual night sounds returned. Insects buzzing, frogs calling, the soft lap of water against cypress roots. But morning revealed where Samuel's bullet had truly gone. It had struck a tree 30 feet away, and embedded beside the bullet hole was one of their knives. The blade had been driven deep into the wood, exactly at the height where Samuel had been sitting. The angle suggested it had been thrown from above, from the tree canopy. At the exact moment he fired blindly into the dark. The meaning was unmistakable. She had been perched directly above them. She could have killed any one of them. Instead, she answered Samuel's violence with a demonstration of precision. She was telling them she had opportunities to harm them, and was deliberately choosing not to. Jacob studied the knife in the bullet hole and understood with chilling clarity that they were no longer in control of anything. The girl they had considered helpless had maneuvered them into a landscape where their weapons, numbers, and physical strength were meaningless. She knew their location at all times, could approach without sound, and was dismantling them psychologically with displays of superiority. The question was no longer whether they would catch her. It was whether they would survive the bottomlands at all. The third morning brought a discovery that shattered any confidence they had left. Henry Burke's rifle was gone, not stolen in the night. Henry insisted he'd been holding it at dawn, but vanished during the brief minutes they'd been rolling their blankets and packing up. One moment the rifle leaned against a tree. The next, it had simply ceased to exist. They panicked, scattering through the brush despite Jacob's furious orders to stay together. That was when the forest itself seemed to turn against them. William Tyson stepped onto what looked like firm earth and plunged waist-deep into sucking mud that nearly swallowed him. While the others hauled him free, Nathaniel Cruz discovered more freshly carved symbols on the trees, arrows pointing in different directions, offering apparent paths forward. But each arrow led them to a dead end. One path circled them back to a creek they had already crossed. Another returned them to the very cluster of fallen logs they had passed that morning. Every direction felt manipulated, controlled. Celia wasn't just avoiding them now. She was hurting them, wearing them down physically and mentally. Their supplies were nearly gone. The food she'd taken the first night had been their reserve stock. They'd been drinking swamp water, risking disease. Nathaniel's fever worsened, leaving him shivering despite the heat. William's leg, injured during his mud plunge, had swollen to twice its size. They were weakening. She, unseen and untouched, was orchestrating their collapse. That afternoon, they heard singing, a woman's voice drifting to the trees in no discernible direction, singing in a language none of them recognized. Creek words woven with something older, stranger. The melody felt as though it came from everywhere and nowhere at once. The sound disoriented them further. making distance impossible to judge. Samuel finally broke. He screamed into the forest, cursing, demanding she show herself, threatening violence he no longer had the strength to inflict. His voice cracked, the bravado stripped away, leaving only fear. Jacob tried to silence him, but Samuel was beyond reason. The others watched with hollow eyes, too exhausted to mimic his rage. They understood what Samuel refused to admit. They had no authority left. The forest belonged to her, and they were intruders collapsing under their own inadequacy. As evening approached, they stumbled into a clearing they didn't recognize. A raised island of dry ground ringed completely by water. Bones covered the earth, mostly animal remains, arranged in patterns that could have been natural or intentional. At the center stood a shelter of branches and moss, recently used. Inside, they found their missing supplies. Not all, but enough. Dried meat, the stolen canteen, and Henry Burke's rifle, carefully unloaded, with the ammunition scattered around it like decorations. It was both an offering and a mockery, a sign of mercy and absolute dominance. She was showing them she could sustain herself, and that she controlled their survival as well. Jacob made a desperate decision. They would stay in this clearing. She would have to approach eventually. They had shelter, a little food, water, and a defensible position. They couldn't win by chasing her. Maybe they could last by remaining still. But waiting meant giving her complete control. It meant sitting exposed, knowing she was somewhere in the trees, watching them, deciding what happened next. The psychological strain was immediate. Every sound became a threat. Every shifting shadow a possible attack. The 5 men sat back to back in the clearing center, rifles pointed outward, waiting for an assault that never came in any predictable form. When the attack finally arrived, it wasn't physical. It was psychological, a steadily escalating torment that exploited every fear they had developed over their 3 nights in the Bottomlands. It began at sunset with footsteps circling them, soft splashes through the water, quick movements, slow movements, always just beyond the clearing's edge, never visible. The sounds approached, then retreated, then approached again, never in a pattern they could anticipate. Sometimes the steps raced as if someone were running. Other times they moved with slow, deliberate confidence, the confidence of a person utterly unafraid of terrain that had nearly broken the 5 men. Then the whispers began, voices and languages none of them recognized. Creek words blended with other dialects, spoken right behind each man's ear even though they sat pressed back to back. The tones shifted constantly, soft and melodic one moment, harsh and jagged the next. Nathaniel swore he heard his own name spoken in his mother's voice, though she had died 15 years earlier. William insisted someone was murmuring scripture, but twisted it, altering familiar verses in subtle ways that made his skin crawl. Jacob tried to keep control, insisting it was all a trick. Psychological manipulation meant to break their resolve. But with each hour that passed, his authority faded. The other men stared into the darkness with hollow eyes, their confidence draining like blood from a wound. Nathaniel, already burning with fever, became convinced something was moving beneath the water, circling them, stalking them. He whispered descriptions of shapes just below the surface, forms unlike any animal he knew, watching them with eyes that reflected the firelight in unnatural colors. The others told him he was hallucinating, but even as they said it, they began watching the water more closely, rifles lifted toward every ripple. Some ripples were surely just wind. Others, they couldn't be sure. The moss curtains hanging from the trees began to sway. There was no breeze, but they moved anyway, sometimes in unison, sometimes independently, swaying in patterns that felt intentional. Henry Burke grew more and more agitated, certain he could make out silhouettes within the hanging moss, human shapes that appeared and evaporated at the edges of his vision. Never solid enough to fire at, but too consistent to dismiss as mere imagination. Around midnight, the sounds changed again. Now it was laughter, a girl's laughter. High, bright, echoing through the swamp from multiple directions at once, north, then south, then east, then overhead, as if she were perched in the canopy watching them. Samuel Yarwick snapped. He rose from formation and fired wildly into the darkness, screaming that she was mocking them, swearing he'd teach her proper respect. His muzzle flashes briefly lit the trees, then plunged them into deeper blindness. When the echoes faded and their vision returned, the laughter resumed. This time it carried a note of genuine amusement, a sound that pierced their pride more effectively than any insult. Jacob grabbed Samuel, dragged him back down, hissed at him to save ammunition. But Samuel's eyes were wild. He muttered about order, about punishment, about putting things back the way they should be. His grasp on reality was disintegrating, and Jacob knew he was powerless to stop it. They all were sliding into a psychological void, where every assumption about power and control was collapsing under them. The fire began behaving strangely. It flared violently, illuminating the entire clearing, then shrank to weak embers despite plenty of fuel. During the bright burst, they glimpsed the forest in vivid detail. The trees, the water, the moss. During the dim intervals, the darkness pressed in so heavily they couldn't see their own hands. During one of those total black intervals, Henry noticed something chilling. Objects in their camp had moved. A pack that had been on his left was now on his right. A rifle leaning on one tree now rested against another. Small, precise changes. Someone was entering their clearing during the moments they were blind, rearranging their possessions, demonstrating complete access and absolute control. Around 2 a.m, they heard singing again, but this time the voice wasn't distant. It came from a shelter in the center of the clearing, the very structure where they had found their supplies earlier. The voice was close, clear, unmistakably feminine, singing in Creek words they couldn't understand, a melody heavy with grief and strength. All 5 men turned their rifles on the shelter. The singing didn't stop. William whispered they should fire into it, burn it down, force her into the open. But Jacob stopped him sharply. "If she's really inside," Jacob whispered, "and we didn't hear her approach, she wants us to know she's there. She wants us to know she can reach us whenever she chooses." Their weapons were meaningless. The singing ended abruptly. Silence fell, a silence so thick it felt like weight pressing on their chests. They waited. 5 minutes. 10. Nothing. Even the swamp creatures stopped calling. The entire Bottomlands seemed to be listening. Then something touched Jacob's shoulder. He spun, rifle raised, finger tightening on the trigger. But no one was behind him except Samuel, and Samuel was facing the opposite direction. But Jacob had felt it clearly, the pressure of fingers pressing through his shirt. Samuel insisted he hadn't moved, and the terror in his eyes told Jacob he was telling the truth. Over the next hour, each man felt similar touches. The touches kept coming. A brush across the back and neck, a faint pressure against a leg, something gliding past an arm, always just at the edge of sensation, always gone before any of them could react, always impossible to verify. Soon they began turning on each other, accusing their companions of playing tricks, of trying to frighten the others for cruel amusement. But the accusations fell flat. They could see each other, could confirm that no one was moving enough to create those sensations. The truth was worse than any physical threat. She was showing them that even sitting in a tight circle, backs touching, rifles raised, they were not protected from her. She moved among them like mist, intangible, untouchable, invading their space whenever she wished. The boundary between hunter and prey hadn't just blurred, it had inverted completely. Dawn on the 4th day revealed just how close she had been during the night. Their packs had been opened, and inside each one lay an arrangement of gifts, delicate flowers native to the Bottomlands, swamp hibiscus, pickerweed, spider lilies, placed with almost ceremonial care. But the flowers were mixed with something far more disturbing. Locks of hair, each matching the color and texture of the man who owned the pack. The hair had been cut cleanly, not ripped out, but trimmed as though with sharp shears or a perfectly honed blade. Enough strands had been removed from each man to suggest she had been close for a long time, close enough to touch their heads, to work calmly in the darkness while they sat awake and supposedly vigilant. There were strips of cloth as well, taken from their clothing without notice. Henry's shirt was missing a strip from the hem. Samuel's trousers had a square cut from the inner thigh, invisible unless examined carefully. Nathaniel's jacket had buttons missing he hadn't realized were gone. And in Jacob's pack lay a single piece of salvage paper with a drawing on it. 5 stick-figure silhouettes. Simple, childlike, but unmistakably intended to represent them. Each figure carried identifiable details. Jacob drawn taller than the rest. Samuel placed close to him. Nathaniel marked with symbols reflecting illness. 4 of the figures had X marks carved over their chests. Deliberate crosses that needed no interpretation. The 5th figure, the one clearly representing Jacob, bore no mark. It stood slightly apart from the others, unfinished, questioning. The meaning was unmistakable. She had been close enough to take from them, close enough to harm them, and she had chosen not to. 4 X's, 1 unanswered figure. It wasn't a threat. It was a decision waiting to be made. Jacob stared at the drawing and felt something inside him break. His entire life had been built on dominance, on the certainty that authority and force shaped the world. For 30 years that belief had held true. Enslaved people obeyed because they feared him. Other overseers deferred because they recognized his brutality. The plantation hierarchy reinforces importance at every level. But here, in this clearing, surrounded by proof of his own helplessness, everything he believed collapsed. He wasn't dealing with someone who feared him. He was dealing with someone who pitied him, someone offering mercy he didn't deserve. And the psychological wound of that realization cut deeper than any physical blow. That morning, Nathaniel Cruz didn't wake up. His fever had overtaken him completely. His breathing had grown shallow during the night, and sometime before dawn, it simply stopped. They checked for a pulse, found none, and stared at his body in hollow silence. The first of them to die, not by violence, but by illness amplified by exhaustion, dehydration, and 3 days of relentless psychological pressure from prey they could not catch. Jacob made the decision to leave him behind. They couldn't carry a corpse through the swamp, and staying meant all of them would die. It was ugly, simple arithmetic. Survival didn't allow sentiment, but abandoning Nathaniel felt like crossing a threshold. They had entered this forest as hunters, as men with power. Now they were leaving their dead behind and running like animals, all pretense of authority stripped away. Samuel insisted they bury him, but Jacob pointed out the truth. They had no tools. The ground was waterlogged. Digging would take hours they didn't have. It would only give her more time to arrange whatever came next. They left Nathaniel in the clearing with what little water remained, a gesture without meaning, and kept moving. Now they were 4, weakened, carrying the weight of abandonment in their minds. Each man thought the same thing, though none dared say it aloud. Who would be the next body left behind? The forest seemed to constrict as they moved. Paths narrowed, water deepened. Solid ground appeared less often. They moved single file through passageways barely wide enough for one person. Cypress roots snagged their legs as though deliberately trying to hold them. Mud clung to their boots with every step, as if the swamp itself wanted to drag them down. Henry Burke, walking at the front, repeatedly stepped onto ground that looked solid but plunged him waist-deep into black water after a few steps. He'd test the soil, call it safe, take 3 paces and vanish into hidden pools. After the 5th such fall, his confidence shattered completely. He refused to take the lead again, but someone had to, and Jacob, walking last, insisted rank still mattered, even here, where rank meant almost nothing. William Tyson's injured leg finally failed around midday. He collapsed into water up to his chest, unable to rise. When the others tried to lift him, the shifting ground nearly took them down with him. His leg had swollen grotesquely, the skin stretched and discolored in ways that hinted at a deep infection. the kind of infection that needed medical care, clean water, and decades too early for them, antibiotics that wouldn't exist until long after their bones had decayed. What William had instead of medical treatment was 3 desperate men trying to keep him upright in a swamp determined to swallow him. They struggled for 10, maybe 15 minutes, searching for even a patch of stable earth that could bear his weight. But the more they moved, the deeper the mire pulled them down. Jacob finally made the same cold calculation he had made with Nathaniel. William was slowing them, costing precious energy they could no longer spare, and his condition would only deteriorate. Henry and Samuel met Jacob's eyes with horror, understanding what he was about to suggest before he spoke a word. William understood too. He stopped struggling and looked at each of them in turn. There was no accusation in his face, only resignation. He'd known this moment was coming from the second his leg gave out. He'd felt his companion's fear stretching thinner and thinner with every failed attempt to move him. "Go," he whispered. "She's watching anyway. Staying just means she takes all of us." In the chaos of trying to find stable footing, in their frantic attempts to pull themselves free of the mud, William Tyson slipped away, not dragged under by any creature, not attacked, simply lost to gravity, water, and the exhaustion of a body that could no longer fight. They heard him thrashing, calling out with fading strength, and then the swamp went still. The Bottomlands claimed him with effortless indifference, and none of them had the physical strength or the moral reserve to attempt another rescue. Now they were 3, Jacob, Samuel, and Henry, staggering through a nightmare landscape that seemed determined to crush them. Their ammunition was nearly gone. They had wasted too many shots on phantoms. Their food was gone. Their water was nothing but contaminated swamp runoff that would almost certainly sicken them. They were lost, unable to retrace their route, unable to guess which direction led back to the plantation that suddenly felt like a memory from another lifetime, though only 4 days had passed. The trees around them now bore constant markings, creek symbols they couldn't interpret. Some were directional, almost like guidance. Others felt ominous, like warnings. All of them meant the same thing. She was recording the hunt. Not the hunt of her, but the hunt of them. She was cataloging the overseers the way hunters catalog their quarry, documenting the collapse of her pursuers. That afternoon, delirious and half-conscious, the 3 men stumbled into a clearing and found Celia waiting. She stood on the opposite bank of a small pond, unmistakably visible in the pale afternoon light filtering through the cypress canopy. She made no effort to hide or flee. She simply stood there, still and composed after days of being everywhere and nowhere, finally allowing them to see her fully. She was nothing like the terrified fugitive they had expected to corner. Her clothes were muddy but intact, practical garments shaped for movement. Her face was marked with charcoal and clay patterns, not random smears but deliberate designs that could be camouflage or something ceremonial. Her hair was tied back with woven plant fibers. She was barefoot, her feet unmarred despite days in the swamp. Most striking was her expression. There was no fear, no anger, no triumph, only calm analysis. The gaze of someone who understood the situation better than anyone else present. In her hands rested a bow crafted from forest materials, the kind of hunting weapon her Creek ancestors had built for generations. The wood was shaped flawlessly. The bowstring looked like woven plant fiber or sinew. The arrow, nocked but not drawn, was beautifully made with a stone tip and feather fletching. She had created a functional weapon while staying ahead of 5 armed men. Behind her lay their missing items, arranged deliberately on the ground. The rope they had brought, now transformed into snares and deadfall triggers. The ammunition she'd stolen lying neatly in a row. Henry's missing rifle, disassembled and unloaded. Their knives placed in patterns suggesting she'd been studying their tools, learning their strengths and weaknesses. For a long moment, no one moved. The 3 surviving overseers stood at the clearing's edge with rifles raised but hands trembling, unsure where to aim or what to do. This girl, this teenager, had dismantled them without a single act of direct violence. She had used the swamp, used their fear, use their own mistakes until the environment itself finished what she began. Jacob Yarrow found his voice first. "You've had your fun," he rasped, trying to project authority he no longer possessed. "But it ends here. You're coming back with us, and you'll face punishment for this." Celia tilted her head slightly, studying him with the same calm evaluation she'd shown since the moment they arrived. When she spoke, her voice carried clearly across the water, firm, steady, unafraid. Her accent blended Creek inflections with the local Georgia drawl, marking her as someone who belonged to both worlds and neither. "Punishment," she said, "for running when you meant harm? For surviving when you meant capture? For knowing my mother's land better than you know your own greed?" Samuel Yarwick stepped forward, lifting his rifle more deliberately. "You killed Nathaniel and William," he snarled. "That's murder, and you'll hang for it." Celia answered without raising her voice. "I killed no one. Your friend died of fever you couldn't treat. The other drowned in water. He couldn't escape. I touched neither. The forest took them because they didn't belong here, didn't understand how to move through it, just as it will take you if you don't leave now." Jacob raised his rifle, sighting down the barrel. His hands shook from exhaustion, rage, and lingering humiliation, but his intent was unmistakable. After everything, the loss of control, the deaths, the erosion of authority, he was determined to end this. One bullet, and he could claim she attacked them. They could say it was self-defense, blame her for the others' deaths. The county would believe him. No one would accept the truth that they had been outmatched by a girl who never once laid a hand on them. He pulled the trigger. The gun misfired. For days of swamp water had ruined the powder. Mud clogged the barrel. Moisture fouled the cartridge. The hollow click of the failed shot was the loudest sound in the clearing. Celia drew her bow in answer, her movement fluid, practiced, and executed in one seamless motion. The arrow struck the ground 6 inches from Jacob's right foot, burying itself in the soft earth at a precise angle. It was a display of complete mastery. She had aimed exactly where she intended, showing unmistakably that she could have placed that arrow in his chest if she had chosen. His life continued solely because she permitted it. Before any of them could react, she had already knocked a second arrow, half-drawn, ready to release fully if they made even one wrong move. "For men entered these bottomlands," she said, her voice still calm but carrying a sharper edge now, signaling that her patience had reached its end. 2 are dead from their own inability to survive here. 2 more can join them, or 1 can walk out alive and carry a message back to Gresham and to anyone else who believes ownership is stronger than knowledge. She gestured to the array of items behind her. Their supplies, their weapons, everything they brought into the swamp now neatly arranged under control. "I could have killed you the first night," she continued. "Cut your throats while you slept, push you into deep water. 100 ways offered freely by this forest. I didn't, because I wanted you to understand something before you died or before you left. You don't own the forest. You don't own people who know it better than you. You don't own anything except your ignorance. And that ignorance is what killed your friends." Henry Burke broke first. For days of fear, of disorientation, of psychological torment, and reverse power dynamics, everything snapped inside him. He dropped his rifle as if it were red-hot iron, turned, and fled. He ran with the last of his strength, crashing blindly back through the dense vegetation. Branches tore his skin, roots snagged his feet, water splashed up to his waist, and he didn't care. He ran like an animal that finally understood it was prey. Samuel hesitated, torn between loyalty to his brother and his own survival instinct. Jacob's face showed no emotion now, only a hollow, exhausted acceptance of total defeat. Samuel made his choice. He had followed Jacob into this nightmare, but he would not follow him into death. He turned and sprinted after Henry, leaving Jacob alone in the clearing with a girl who had dismantled their entire world without once attacking them directly. Jacob Yarrow stood alone, facing Celia across the pond. His rifle hung uselessly from hands too weak to lift it. He understood with absolute clarity that he had lost everything: his authority, his reputation, even the illusion of power. He was an intruder in her land, and she was offering him mercy he had done nothing to earn, mercy that tasted bitter even as he desperately needed it. "Why?" he asked, his voice sounding like it belonged to another man. "Why let any of us live?" Celia lowered her bow slightly, only slightly, but kept the arrow knocked. "Because dead men don't carry messages," she answered. "Someone needs to tell Gresham what happened here. Someone needs to tell the other overseers. Someone needs to make him understand that running doesn't always mean prey, and hunting doesn't always mean control." She paused, then added something that would haunt Jacob for the rest of his days. "My mother taught me to read this forest the way you read your account books. Every plant, every sound, every shift in wind or water, they all speak. If you listen." She taught me because she knew this day might come. She knew knowledge is the only power that can't be taken by force. "You enter my mother's classroom with guns," she said, "expecting weakness, and you found strength you never bothered to imagine." She nodded toward the direction Henry and Samuel had fled. "Walk away. Tell your story. Maybe someone will learn from it, though I doubt it. Men like you don't learn from losing. You just find new ways to convince yourselves you didn't really lose." Jacob opened his mouth, wanted to salvage some flicker of dignity from the wreckage, but there was nothing left. He was a man who defined himself by dominance and control, and both had been stripped away so completely he barely recognized himself. He turned, leaving his useless rifle behind, and stumbled after the path his companions had taken, driven only by the primal desire to reach familiar ground alive. He had no dignity left, only desperation. Behind him, Celia's voice rose one final time, carrying clearly through the trees. "The Bottomlands remember, and I remember. If Gresham sends more men, I'll be here. Next time, none walk out." Henry Burke emerged from the Ohiapo Bottomlands 36 hours after the three survivors split. He crawled out of treeline on his hands and knees, delirious, caked in mud and covered with scratches arranged across his skin like cryptic writing. His clothes were shredded, his boots gone, his hands raw with cuts from grabbing at roots and branches in blind panic. Plantation workers found him near the eastern boundary just after dawn. He was babbling, half-metallic words about forests that moved, girls who multiplied, water that swallowed men whole. They carried him to the overseer quarters and tried to question him, but he couldn't form coherent sentences. He repeated only fragments. She was everywhere, in the trees, under the water, behind us. She touched us while we watched. The forest listened to her. The forest listened. Thomas Gresham summoned a doctor from the county seat, a man accustomed to fever, exhaustion, and swamp delirium. After examining Burke, he declared the overseer physically intact but mentally shattered. The scratches were superficial, signs of frantic running through underbrush. His dehydration was severe but treatable. His mind, however, was another matter. For 3 days, Burke drifted in and out of semi-consciousness, waking only to scream, then collapsing into fitful sleep. When he finally became lucid enough to speak clearly, his account was so disturbing that Gresham refused to believe it at first. Burke described 4 days of systematic, calculated psychological dismantling. He spoke of a girl who moved like smoke, who appeared in multiple places at once, who controlled a landscape that defeated 5 armed men. He insisted she touched them repeatedly, stole from them in plain view, that the forest itself had somehow aligned with her against them. Burke repeated over and over, she knew. She knew everything, where we'd step, where we'd look, what we'd do next. It was like she'd run this hunt 100 times before, knew every mistake we'd make before we made it. When Gresham pressed him about the other 4 overseers, Burke's expression went blank. He stared at the wall for several long minutes before answering. Nathaniel died of fever. William drowned. Jacob and Samuel. I don't know. I ran. When she gave us the choice, I ran. The next morning, Gresham organized a search party, 10 armed men from neighboring plantations, none of them his own enslaved workers, all supplied for a week in the swamp. They entered the Bottomlands with Burke's rough list of landmarks, following the direction the overseers had taken. 3 days into the search, they found Samuel Yarwood's body. He lay face down in a shallow creek 2 miles from the plantation boundary. The water wasn't even deep enough to cover his chest, but he was motionless, bloated by the humid heat. The coroner found no signs of violence, no wounds, no struggle marks. Samuel had simply collapsed in water no deeper than a puddle, too exhausted to lift his head. The swamp hadn't killed him. His own deterioration had. After finding Samuel, the search party refused to go further. They reported shifting terrain, landmarks that seemed to move, symbols carved into trees in patterns they couldn't interpret. Several of the men insisted they felt watched every moment. Others claimed that sounds in the night didn't match any known animal. Supplies were found rearranged at campsites despite guards keeping watch. After 5 days, Gresham ended the search. 3 men, Jacob Yarrow, William Tyson, and Nathaniel Cruz, remained unaccounted for. The official county record declared them lost to swamp conditions, a vague phrase chosen to avoid questions about how 5 overseers could fail so catastrophically while pursuing a teenage girl. Jacob Yarrow's fate remained unknown for 2 more weeks. Then hunters in neighboring county found remains deep in the Bottomlands, 6 miles beyond where the search party had stopped. The body was too decomposed for a definitive identification, but pieces of clothing and a distinctive pocket watch confirmed it was Jacob. It appeared he had kept walking after the confrontation in the clearing, either trying to find his own way home or refusing to follow his brother's path. Whatever his intentions, he walked deeper instead of out, and the swamp claimed him. William Tyson and Nathaniel Cruz were never recovered. Their bodies remained somewhere in the Bottomlands, claimed by scavengers and decay, absorbed into the ecosystem that had destroyed them. The swamp devoured people completely, leaving no trace besides memory. Henry Burke stayed at the Gresham plantation for 2 weeks after crawling out of the forest. Though his body improved, his mind deteriorated further. He slept only in brief, restless spurts, waking at sounds no one else heard, staring into corners no one else found frightening. He refused to go near the eastern boundary. He wouldn't even look toward the tree line. The enslaved workers watched his decline with an expression that mixed satisfaction with something deeper, something almost like validation. The quiet acknowledgement that the power structure built over them wasn't as invincible as it pretended to be. Burke, who had been casually cruel for 2 years, now flinched at bird calls and scratched symbols into the dirt whenever he thought no one was watching. Those symbols became a quiet topic of conversation. They were creek markings, some recognizable from old interactions before removal, others far older than any living memory. Some insisted they predated European arrival entirely. Whatever their origins, Burke drew them obsessively, copying the patterns he'd seen carved into trees in the Bottomlands, as though trying to decipher a message that wasn't meant for him. When Burke finally left Wilkinson County, he told anyone who would listen that they had been hunted from the moment they stepped into the swamp. Not attacked, he always clarified. Hunted, in the worst way. Studied, measured, guided into our own mistakes. She never had to hurt us. The forest hurt us. Our ignorance hurt us. She just watched, guided us right into every danger we didn't know enough to avoid. Most dismissed his words as fever-induced hallucination, perhaps a traumatized mind struggling to make sense of unbearable fear. But those who truly knew the Bottomlands heard something else, an understanding that knowledge of the land could be weaponized, that someone who mastered the wilderness could manipulate it in ways that seemed supernatural to outsiders. Burke eventually moved to Alabama, working quietly as a clerk in a general store. He refused every offer of overseer work. He lived another 33 years, dying in 1872. And until the day he died, he insisted the Ohiapo Bottomlands in October 1839 contained the most terrifying experience a human being could endure. not because of monsters or violence, but because it revealed how helpless people become when they step into an environment they don't understand while chasing someone who does. Celia was never seen again at the Gresham plantation. Thomas Gresham filed a formal runaway notice describing her appearance and escape, but no serious effort followed. When the sheriff was asked to pursue her, he simply attempted, what exactly did Gresham expect a sheriff's deputy to accomplish? He couldn't articulate an answer that didn't sound foolish. How could he admit that he needed Celia caught not because of her labor value, but because if she escaped successfully, it would shatter his authority over the remaining enslaved people? How could he confess that his entire operation depended on the belief that escape was impossible, and one successful fleeing proved the opposite? The enslaved community at Gresham's plantation noted Celia's disappearance with quiet satisfaction, carefully hidden whenever white eyes were present. During brief moments when surveillance lapsed, whispers spread. They shared what they'd heard about the forest, about the overseers, about the chase. Each retelling grew slightly more embellished, gaining mythic edges, but the core stayed the same. One of their own had faced the overseer's worst intentions, and one, she had turned hunters into prey using only knowledge her mother passed on, knowledge older than slavery, older than plantations, older than overseers. The stories traveled quickly through the county, past person in networks of communication that white planners never understood or severely underestimated. Within a month, enslaved communities across Wilkinson County knew some version of what had happened when 5 overseers chased a Creek girl into the Bottomlands. Details changed with each plantation. Some versions claimed Celia killed the overseers outright. Others insisted the forest rose up to help her. A few hinted at supernatural intervention, but all versions carried the same powerful message. Resistance was possible. Escape was achievable. Knowledge could overcome force. Thomas Gresham's plantation began collapsing almost immediately after October 1839. Outsiders didn't connect the decline to Bottomlands incident at first, but his sharper neighbors recognized the pattern. Small acts of resistance multiplied day by day. Subtle inefficiencies accumulated into major losses. And most importantly, no overseer in the region was willing to work for Gresham again. Word had raced through overseer networks about what happened to Yarrow and his men. The stories varied wildly, but every version ended with the same truth. Gresham's plantation was where overseers wanted to die or lose their minds. The few men who came to inquire about positions asked very pointed questions. Did the job require entering the Bottomlands? What had actually happened to the previous crew? Why were so many overseers needed in the first place? Gresham's evasive answers convinced them to look elsewhere. Without overseers enforcing discipline through fear, Gresham couldn't maintain the brutal efficiency cotton demanded. Production dropped 20% in 1840, another 30% in 1841. His enslaved workers weren't openly rebellious. They showed up, they worked, but they moved at their own pace with their own quiet, uncooperative rhythms, and Gresham had no power left to force more. Tools vanished and reappeared inexplicably. Cotton bales arrived at weighing lighter than expected. Fences constantly needed repair. Equipment broke far too often to be coincidence. By 1842, Gresham was bankrupt. He sold the plantation at a devastating loss to a speculator from South Carolina, an unlucky buyer who knew nothing of its history. He wouldn't learn about the Bottomlands incident until after the papers were signed. The new owner tried restoring profitability with increased brutality, hiring overseers with vicious reputations. But they met the same resistance Gresham had. Not open rebellion, but quiet, constant defiance that made productivity nearly impossible. The plantation changed hands 3 more times in 8 years. Every new owner discovered that the land seemed cursed. Enslaved workers here were different, more self-possessed, less intimidated, harder to control. None of them connected it back to the events of 1839, to a teenage girl who proved that authority could be overturned not with violence, but with knowledge. The Ohiapo Bottomlands retained their dangerous reputation, but the nature of that danger evolved. The The swamp became more than treacherous terrain. It became a symbol, a place where plantation power ended, a place where the natural order failed, a place where the rules of the antebellum South simply didn't apply. It became understood, quietly but firmly, that fugitives who reached the bottomlands were beyond the reach of white authority. Search parties hesitated to enter. The swamp had become a psychological barrier stronger than any physical one. Whether Celia actually remained in the bottomlands or traveled further was impossible to confirm, but stories persisted for decades. Travelers claimed that a woman emerged from the forest to guide them through treacherous bogs, leading them to safety before disappearing without accepting thanks. These accounts were remarkably consistent. The guide was always of mixed Creek and African ancestry, always demonstrated uncanny knowledge of the terrain, always vanished before her name could be asked. Historians tended to dismiss these tales as folklore, shared myths that grew wherever wilderness and danger intersected. They pointed out that the description stayed too consistent over decades, suggesting a cultural story rather than sightings of an actual woman who would have aged noticeably over time. But oral traditions among Creek families and African-descended communities offered a different story. They spoke of a semi-permanent settlement deep in the swamps, a hidden community of escaped people who survived using ancestral knowledge of the land. These accounts described individuals who occasionally emerged to help other runaways escape north. And these stories named Celia directly as one of the settlement's founders, someone who used her own escape and survival to establish routes and protocols for others. Whether these oral histories record literal truth or wishful reconstruction is impossible to prove. No physical evidence of such a settlement has been discovered, but the bottomlands destroy structures quickly. Anything built that would melt back into the swamp within a few years. No written records from the period mention organized runaway communities in the Ohiapo swamps. Those slaveholders had every reason to hide such information if they knew it existed. What is documented across multiple sources is that Wilkinson County experienced an unusually high rate of successful escapes between 1840 and 1860. Enslaved people from plantations bordering the bottomlands disappeared far more often than those living farther west. Pursuit teams returned empty-handed at higher rates than in comparable Georgia counties. Something about the Ohiapo region made escape more viable, whether it was the swamp itself or the presence of people who had mastered living within it. The official court records from October 1839 are incomplete, many pages mysteriously missing from the county archives. What remains is fragmentary testimony from Henry Burke, taken while he was still recovering. The clerk noted that Burke's statements seemed impossible to credit, yet were delivered with such conviction that disbelief felt inadequate to explain them away. Burke's testimony described systematic psychological warfare, a girl who moved through the forest with unnatural ease, someone who anticipated their actions, who understood the terrain intimately, who demonstrated mastery of a landscape that killed the men who pursued her. He described her crafting weapons from natural materials, navigating in total darkness, approaching them repeatedly without being heard, and ultimately granting mercy to men who had earned none. After reviewing Burke's testimony and examining the remains of Samuel and Jacob Yarrow, the court reached a remarkable verdict. It concluded that all deaths resulted from natural causes exacerbated by poor judgment, noting that the deceased entered hostile terrain without adequate preparation, pursued a quarry who possessed superior knowledge of said terrain, and subsequently perished through exposure, exhaustion, and environmental hazards. No evidence suggests deliberate violence. The runaway Negro girl, Celia, is charged with flight, but cannot be held responsible for deaths resulting from the pursuer's inadequate skills. For its time, the ruling was astonishing. It acknowledged, openly, that enslaved people could possess knowledge superior to their oppressors, that environment could trump force, that pursuing someone without respecting their mastery of the land could be fatal. Some historians argue the verdict reflected the court's fear of admitting something even more dangerous, that a teenage girl had defeated 5 armed overseers through strategy, not luck. The symbolism of that verdict was not lost on enslaved communities throughout Georgia. The idea that knowledge could overcome violence spread through communication networks and became part of a growing resistance culture. The story of Celia and the Bottomlands joined other narratives of survival, teaching lessons about how to endure, how to fight back, and how to win on terms the slave system did not understand. Thomas Gresham died in 1851 in Texas, where he attempted to restart his cotton operations. He encountered similar problems there: workers who resisted subtly, overseers who quit abruptly, yields that never met expectations. His obituary in a Houston newspaper described him as a man of moderate success whose ambitions exceeded his luck. It made no mention of Georgia, the Bottomlands, or the 5 men whose pursuit destroyed his authority. Henry Burke died in 1872 in Alabama, having lived 33 years after emerging from the swamp. His obituary noted his work as a store clerk and his peculiar views regarding wilderness areas. Family members reported he never spoke about his overseer years, except to warn relatives never to enter unfamiliar forests for work. They also found drawings among his belongings, symbols he had copied from the Bottomlands decades earlier, preserved as though he spent his entire life trying to decipher their meaning. The ultimate question: what truly happened in the Ohiapo Bottomlands in October 1839, remains open to interpretation. The physical facts are straightforward. 5 men entered, for died from environmental causes. 1 emerged psychologically broken. The girl they pursued was never recaptured. No physical violence was proven. No supernatural elements documented. But the psychological and social impacts were profound. The incident demonstrated that knowledge of the environment could be weaponized. That pursuit didn't guarantee capture. That people dismissed as powerless could defeat those presumed superior through strategy and terrain mastery. These lessons rippled outward, changing how enslaved people thought about resistance, how slaveholders thought about control, and how Southern society understood the fragility of its supposed power structure. The story spread far beyond Wilkinson County, carried by enslaved people sold south, by overseers whispering cautionary tales, by travelers hearing locals speak of mysterious swamp. The specifics shifted with each retelling, but the core remained constant. A girl pursued by 5 armed men survived. Her pursuers did not, and that reversal exposed possibilities a plantation system depended on people never recognizing. Modern historians of antebellum resistance often cite the Celia incident as a prime example of how individual acts of survival evolved into collective mythology, how specific events became broader lessons about power, knowledge, and possibility. Whether every detail preserved in oral histories is literally true matters less than what the story accomplished, proving that resistance was real, that oppression was not unbreakable, and that ancestral knowledge could be more powerful than any weapon. The Bottomlands themselves remained lethal long after 1839, claiming more lives in the decades that followed. But they also remained a symbol, a reminder that some places lay forever beyond the plantation system's control, shaped by knowledge that could never be stolen or extinguished. Resistance didn't always require violence. Sometimes it was quiet, rooted in understanding, and just as powerful. Even today, hikers moving through what remains of the Ohiapo Bottomlands sometimes report uncanny sensations. The feeling of being watched, hearing sounds that match no known animal, finding symbols carved into ancient trees, markings too precise to dismiss as simple weather damage. Are these echoes of what happened there, or just the human mind searching for meaning in wild spaces? The answer depends on what you believe. Do you think knowledge, carried through generations, shaped by ancestors who survived in these swamps, can leave traces on the land itself? Or do you think the Bottomlands only feel haunted because extraordinary things happened there long ago? So what do you think happened in those Georgia swamps? Was it simply a case of environmental hazards and Celia's superior understanding of the terrain? Or was there something deeper at work in how the forest claimed for overseers? Do you believe Celia survived out there? Maybe even helped establish hidden communities of escaped people living beyond the plantation system's reach? Share your theories in the comments. I want to hear what you think. If this historical account captivated you, Make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss stories like this. Dark histories where the official records tell one version of events, but the deeper truth is much more complicated. Share this video with someone who appreciates narratives of survival against impossible odds, and check out our other explorations into forgotten histories that challenge our assumptions about power, resistance, and how people endure systems designed to break them. The forest keeps many secrets, and together we'll keep uncovering them. Some stories are buried on purpose, because the truths inside them are too uncomfortable for those who benefit from official narratives. But the stories persist, passed down through generations, preserved in fragmented documents and whispered oral traditions, waiting for people willing to ask what really happened. When knowledge confronted force, when terrain became a weapon, when the hunted became something far more dangerous than the hunters ever imagined. See you in the next video.